want to start today with a provocative thought for you. What if the biggest problem with the news isn't really about a journalist's bad faith, or even some hidden political agenda?
But the structure of the market itself.
Exactly. We spend so much time trying to figure out a reporter's bias, but what if the economic system they work in basically dictates the acceptable range of thought before they even type a single word?
That is the essential distinction. It's the entire foundation of the work we're looking at today. It forces us to see the media not as a collection of individual thinkers, but as these massive corporate entities.
Operating under very specific market pressures.
Precisely.
Well, today we're presenting a deep dive into that very concept. Enjoy a bold new take on book coverage with this extended analysis.
It's more than just a summary, right? Though we will include that too.
This feature really examines how the author shapes an argument, how they build influence, and, well, how they earn, or maybe lose, your trust.
It gives you the tools to read with sharper insight, greater discernment.
So the big question is, should you read this book? This deep dive should really help you decide.
And I think it's also excellent for aspiring writers, just to see how these complex arguments get constructed.
Absolutely. And if you find this expanded format valuable, we'd love to hear from you. Your feedback really does help guide our future content.
Our focus today is Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media by Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky. It was published back in 1988, so it came out of the tail end of the Cold War.
And that context is so important. The media ecosystem back then just largely assumed that U.S. foreign policy was benevolent.
And that anti-communism was the unquestioned organizing principle for all international news.
So what was the central proposition they put forward to challenge that consensus?
The core claim is very direct. For its time, it was revolutionary. They argue the U.S. mass media function as, and I'm quoting here, effective and powerful ideological institutions.
Meaning they serve a propaganda function.
A system-supportive propaganda function, yes. But, and this is the key twist, it operates mainly through internal market structures, through self-censorship.
Not through some government ministry of information.
No, not overt state control. The control is decentralized, it's financial, and it's structural.
I find their rhetorical framing just fascinating. Herman and Chomsky, they write from a position of what you might call outsider expertise.
They're dissident intellectuals, diagnosing power.
Right. They're not pretending to be impartial reporters. Their whole ethos is deliberately set against those traditional state and corporate media power structures.
And that analytical style is so crucial to the book's impact. It's not based on emotional appeals.
No polemics.
The tone is cool, it's analytic. Almost like a legal brief, just accumulating evidence. They present this dense, verifiable data content analyses, comparative stats, and then they invite you, the reader, to draw your own conclusions from it.
They want to move you from just a vague skepticism, like I think that reporter's biased, to something much deeper.
To a structural understanding of systemic bias. To see how the system itself is designed to produce a narrow outcome.
A really profound shift in thinking.
And that structural understanding is exactly what they're trying to prove. Before we jump into the architecture of their argument, we should just note for you, our listener, that you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
So let's dive into how they actually built this argument. The first hurdle for them was credibility, wasn't it? If you're positioning yourself as a dissident, how do you earn trust?
Well, they traded heavily on their long-standing reputations for empirical rigor. Their credibility is boosted by what our sources call a methodological seriousness.
Meaning it's not just opinion.
Not at all. It relies on long-run data, detailed content analyses, and this is the most effective part, these carefully chosen comparative case studies.
It signals a social scientific stance.
Which makes it much harder to just dismiss as ideological. They're basically saying, look, we have the receipts.
So the power of the book comes not from the authority of an institution, but from the rigor of the scientific method they're applying. That's a powerful way to frame it.
What's so interesting here is the core conceptual move they make. They rhetorically reframe journalism away from that classic ideal, the noble watchdog of power.
And they present it as a dependent subsystem of power.
That's it. They take what are usually considered just background facts, things like media ownership, who funds the news, the reliance on advertising, and they turn those into the primary explanatory variables for media bias.
Okay, but wait. If we treat concentrated ownership as the primary variable, doesn't that risk letting individual bad actors or or malicious policies off the hook.
That's a really valid intellectual challenge, and it's one of the main critiques of the book, which we'll get to. But for their argument, the point is that individual integrity becomes almost irrelevant if the institution's economic structure dictates the boundaries of debate.
So you stop asking, why did this reporter fail to cover X?
And you start asking, how was the system designed to make X a non-story in the first place?
That is a complete paradigm shift. And the most powerful logical strategy they use to prove that design is systematic comparison.
Yes, the paired case studies. This is the crucial logical architecture of the whole book. They meticulously document how structurally similar events, say elections or atrocities or human rights abuses,
Receive radically different coverage in the U.S. media.
radically different. And the only variable is whether the event involves a U.S. ally or a U.S. adversary.
So the proof of bias isn't some quote or an opinion piece. It's a measurable discrepancy in calling inches in sources quoted in the tone.
Exactly. For instance, if an official U.S. enemy kills 1,000 people, it's front-page news for weeks.
But if a U.S. ally does the same thing, it might get a short paragraph on page 16, if anything, maybe blamed on unfortunate circumstances.
That's the cumulative logic they build. They show that ownership, advertising, sourcing, and what they call flack all work together to explain why dissenting views just stay on the margins.
And it happens without any need for a centralized censor or propaganda minister.
Which brings us, naturally, to the core of the book, the propaganda model itself.
This model is laid out as 5 structural filters. News has to pass through all 5, and they jointly produce a very, very narrow spectrum of acceptable debate.
Let's walk through them. Filter number 1 is ownership.
Right.
The authors stress that media outlets aren't small civic organizations. They're large, multinational, profit-driven corporations.
And they're tied to much wider corporate interests.
And the functional impact of that is critical. It immediately shifts your suspicion away from individual journalists and focuses it right on the systemic corporate structure. You have to be profitable to even exist.
Which means the constraints on profit are baked in from the start. That leads to filter number 2, advertising.
I find this one particularly insightful. The financial reality is that news outlets are so heavily reliant on advertising revenue.
So, as the authors explain, the content is inherently skewed toward attracting affluent audiences, the people advertisers actually want to reach.
And avoiding topics that might upset those commercial interests.
It's a market-based mechanism for soft censorship.
That's it, exactly. If your outlet hosts a discussion that's critical of, say, major pharmaceutical companies, and those companies are your biggest advertisers, well, the pressure is immense.
They don't need to be told what not to publish.
No, they self-censor to protect their financial lifeblood.
Okay, moving to filter number 3, sourcing.
The book claims that media organizations have this heavy, almost exclusive dependence on government and corporate sources.
And the reason is logistics, right? It subsidizes the whole news gathering process.
It's vastly cheaper and faster to send a reporter to a press conference or just reprint a press release than it is to launch a truly independent adversarial investigation.
The function there is pretty clear. It explains why official narratives just inevitably dominate the discourse.
Of course. Government agencies and major corporations, they have the infrastructure to provide a constant stream of credible and free content to journalists.
While dissenting voices who lack that infrastructure are easily dismissed as unreliable, it just perpetuates the cycle.
Then we hit filter number 4, flack.
This isn't just random criticism.
No, this is organized negative feedback. It's designed to discipline any outlet that deviates from the acceptable frames.
So this could be coordinated campaigns, threats of lawsuits,
Public denunciations by powerful figures, organized advertiser boycotts.
So flack shows us the punishment mechanisms. If a newspaper runs a series critical of the defense industry, for example, flack is that coordinated backlash that keeps them inside the ideological consensus.
It's a constant threat that ensures self-censorship stays robust.
And finally, that brings us to filter number 5, which the authors identify as the common ideology enemy.
In the original 1988 edition, this was explicitly anti-communism.
But today, that enemy can shift. It might be terrorism or an economic rival.
Or domestic extremism.
Yeah.
But the functional requirement is the same. That enemy provides a flexible, unifying ideology that's used to marginalize any dissent.
Its function is to explain how fear-based narratives can justify narrowing the range of legitimate views.
When you're fighting an existential threat, as the sources articulate, questioning certain policies just gets labeled as unpatriotic.
Or simply irrelevant. It just silences opposition.
And it's so important to remember that when the book was published, Anti-communism was such an unquestioned organizing principle. Even journalists who saw themselves as fiercely independent, they simply absorbed that framework.
Let's shift a bit now from the structural mechanics to well, the emotional and ethical impact of the book, the pathos.
The sources all point to the worthy versus unworthy victims motif as the main moral lever Herman and Chomsky use.
And this carries all the moral weight, even though the delivery is so dry and analytical. How does that contrast work on the reader?
They juxtapose these cold, undeniable statistics of human suffering, often in places targeted by U.S. policy, with the shocking silence or distortion in mainstream coverage.
That juxtaposition is designed to shock you into seeing your own media's selective compassion.
It is. The reader is drawn to empathize with the victims whose lives, whose suffering, have been erased or minimized just for political expediency.
So, by documenting these systematic discrepancies, the authors are implicitly presenting themselves as defenders of a kind of global moral equality.
That's a great way to put it. They're arguing that all human suffering should be covered equally, regardless of political alliance.
And that critique of systemic double standards it's just profoundly effective. It forces you to confront an uncomfortable truth.
Now, for you, the learner, it's essential to acknowledge the conceptual tensions and the serious criticisms that have been raised against this model. These are crucial tools for better discernment.
And this feels like a perfect moment for a quick pause. If you are finding this breakdown valuable, we encourage you to check out Mindful Moments. This is our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques inspiring reflection and rational thought.
Okay, back to the critiques. The first primary criticism often leveled against the propaganda model is the risk of structural determinism.
Unpack that for us. What does it mean for a theory to risk totalizing determinism?
Well, critics argue that the model is so comprehensive, the 5 filters are so interlocking, that the framework risks becoming unfalsifiable.
Meaning, if every single instance of news coverage can be explained by one of the filters.
Then it becomes almost impossible to specify what kind of reporting wouldn't confirm the model. It could become a closed, circular loop of logic.
Which is a major academic challenge. A useful model has to be capable of being proven wrong by the data, right?
Precisely. And then there's the criticism of underplaying agency.
The agency of individual journalists.
Yes. The framework is designed to foreground the structural constraints. But this perspective can sometimes treat individual integrity or genuinely adversarial reporting, which does happen, as just statistical noise, mere exceptions.
So the argument is that by focusing so heavily on the structure, the model doesn't really account for the heroism of some reporters who push back, or just the sheer variability of human decision-making inside these places.
It's as if the structure is prioritized so heavily that individual choice and conscience almost disappear.
A real tension there.
It is. They prioritize the long-term trend over the individual victory. And finally, there's the issue of scope creep.
The model was written for a specific Cold War context.
Where anti-communism was the unquestioned organizing principle, yes. And as the world changed...
That ideological filter had to change, too.
Exactly. When the model is extended beyond that original setting, shifting from anti-communism to, say, the war on terror or modern hyperpolarization, it requires a lot of reinterpretation.
And the original 1988 edition doesn't offer a lot of guidance on how those filters should adjust over time.
Or whether they even retain the same explanatory power in our current, highly fractured digital media environment.
So if we step back, this book's ultimate takeaway isn't really to provide the final answer on everything.
No, it's to execute that critical reorientation of thought we talked about at the start.
The key understanding it gives you is a shift from asking, are journalists honest, to asking a much more profound question.
A more useful question. How do institutional incentives and economic structures shape what even counts as news? How is reality sliced, ranked, and framed for all of us?
And that shift has these profound implications for democratic agency.
It really does. It forces us to realize that what often passes as neutral or objective reporting is, according to Herman and Chomsky, actually a structurally produced bias.
A set of normalized constraints that conveniently exclude perspectives that threaten elite interests or market stability.
The book, in essence, challenges the conventional ideal of objectivity itself. It argues that what looks like neutrality is often just the normalization of highly effective structural constraints.
A powerful message that still feels incredibly relevant decades later.
It really does.
So what does this all mean for us today, especially as we consume media on all these new platforms? Here's a provocative closing question for you to consider. What surprising structural bias, independent of ideology, something like platform engagement algorithms, the 24-hour news cycle, or the constant need for digital clicks, might be shaping the specific news you consume right now?
A challenging thought to take forward.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe, nourish your mind on the go.